She didn't say much, at least not in public. But the ripple of her actions, quiet, calculated, almost invisible at first glance, was about to hit harder than anyone expected. Imagine being in a position where the world assumes you're simply another member of the royal family, where protocol, tradition, and centuries of carefully orchestrated appearances define every move you make. Now imagine that in a single, almost imperceptible decision, you trigger consequences that could shake the foundations of that institution, and not in theory, but in reality. That's the story we're about to unfold. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. It begins with Prince Harry. He has always lived under a microscope, of course, and he has navigated the world with a degree of self-awareness that many might envy. But awareness, as we will see, isn't always enough. Even the most careful person can find themselves caught in a web of circumstances they never intended to enter. And in this case, it wasn't just circumstance. Something deliberate was at play. Something that forced a halt to what many assumed was his unquestioned right, his inheritance. Yes, frozen. Not delayed. Not redirected. Frozen. Now, I know what you're thinking. Inheritance? Royal inheritance? Isn't this just another financial maneuver behind closed doors? And on the surface, maybe that's what it looks like. But appearances, in this story, are deceptive. Because what we're talking about isn't simply money. It's control. It's power. And, crucially, it's about trust. Trust that once was assumed, but which now has cracked in ways that may never be reparable. The public may never see the memos, the private communications, the exchanges that set this in motion. They will only see the aftermath, a prince unable to access what had been promised, a palace increasingly tense, a king reportedly furious beyond measure, and the swirling questions that no official statement can ever satisfy. And at the center of this, Meghan Markle. Yes, her name, again, looms large. But what exactly her role is, whether as instigator, facilitator, or simply an unavoidable catalyst, is something we will examine with care. Because in stories like this, certainty is rare, and assumptions can be dangerous. Let's pause for a moment and consider why this matters. For the general public, inheritance disputes among the elite often feel distant, abstract, maybe even trivial. But the stakes here are fundamentally different. We're talking about succession, legacy, and the integrity of a family that, for better or worse, represents a national symbol. And more than that, there's an emotional thread that runs through all of this, a thread that ties past heartbreaks to present crises, a thread that connects the unresolved grief surrounding Princess Diana to the turbulent lives of her sons today. And Diana's prophecy, that enigmatic, haunting statement she made years ago, has emerged in conversations behind palace doors. A warning, perhaps more literal than anyone dared imagine at the time. What she foresaw wasn't simply scandal, it was fracture. And now, some insist, the prophecy is being confirmed. Piece by piece, action by action, we are watching a chain of events unfold that seems almost preordained, almost impossible to stop. Yet, even as this prophecy takes shape, the details are messy, contradictory, and, most importantly, entirely human. Which brings us to the next element, DNA. Not just DNA as a scientific fact, a sterile confirmation of lineage, but DNA as leverage, DNA as revelation, DNA as a weapon in a drama that spans decades. Because the question now circulating in the whispers of those with access to confidential information is not if Archie is Harry's son, but whether he is, at all. And if the answer is what some insiders claim, the implications are seismic. It would reshape perceptions of parentage, inheritance rights, and perhaps even public loyalty. Suddenly, the inheritance freeze doesn't look like a matter of finance alone. It is entwined with lineage, legitimacy, and the perception of truth itself. You might feel your mind racing at this point. How could so many threads intersect? How could a single family dispute touch on money, prophecy, paternity, and the monarchy all at once? It's almost too much to process. And yet, that's the nature of this story. Complex, layered, almost impossibly intricate. The deeper you dig, the more each revelation only raises further questions. And the most uncomfortable part? Even those closest to the events may not fully understand the reach of what is happening. let's talk about the human dimension for a moment. Harry, confronted with this freeze, must be feeling something complicated: betrayal, frustration, perhaps disbelief. Imagine the frustration of expecting what was promised, only to find it inaccessible, contingent upon factors you cannot control. Add to that the emotional turbulence of a mother's warning echoing decades later, and the stakes become as psychological as they are practical. And Meghan, meanwhile, is not simply a passive figure in this drama. Her influence, her counsel, and her actions, subtle or overt, have helped shape a situation that now seems irreversible. Whether intentionally or not, the impact is undeniable. The broader royal family cannot remain untouched either. King Charles, long accustomed to navigating protocol and perception, now faces a situation that tests patience, judgment, and authority in a way that is unusually raw. His reported fury, while perhaps unsurprising to those who know him, underscores a critical tension: the conflict between familial loyalty and institutional responsibility. What should a monarch do when the personal collides so dramatically with the public role? How does one reconcile a prophecy made in private decades earlier with events that are erupting in real time? These are not theoretical questions. They are immediate, pressing, and deeply consequential. And yet, even as all of this unfolds, the public narrative is fragmented. Leaks, rumors, selective reporting, all of it competes with official silence. That gap between what is known and what is being revealed is where this story thrives. It is where suspense lives. Because each revelation, each confirmation, adds another layer, but never quite resolves the central mystery. We know something significant has happened. We know the inheritance is frozen. We know DNA evidence is stirring controversy. But we do not yet know the full scope, nor the final consequences. And therein lies the tension that will drive this investigation forward. Consider also the timing. In any long-running saga, timing matters. Actions taken at certain moments ripple outward in ways that are often unexpected. A move that seems minor, an email sent, a phone call made, a document quietly signed, can catalyze a cascade of consequences. In this case, timing intersects with history. Diana's words, spoken decades ago, have taken on a haunting resonance now. And the current decisions being made by Meghan, Harry, and the King are framed by that historical shadow, making each choice heavier, each consequence more charged. But there's another layer, subtler, almost invisible, yet critically important: public perception. How will this be understood by those outside the palace walls? By the media, by fans, by critics? Will Harry's image as a dutiful son and concerned father survive the scrutiny of these revelations? Will Meghan's reputation be framed as manipulative, strategic, or something else entirely? And perhaps most intriguingly, how does the monarchy manage a crisis where the evidence is partially known, partially secret, and partially speculative? These are not just PR questions. They are existential questions about legacy, authority, and narrative control. At the center of it all, there's a question the audience might quietly ask themselves: what would I do if I were in Harry's shoes? If a promise, a right, a legacy you had counted on suddenly evaporated, frozen, inaccessible, how would you react? The question is uncomfortable because it forces empathy, but also because it demands recognition of the scale of this conflict. We are not simply talking about a family disagreement. We are talking about a collision between personal desire, legal reality, and historical weight. And as we contemplate that collision, another question begins to emerge: how much of this was foreseeable? Could anyone have predicted that a prophecy made decades earlier, an inheritance structured over generations, and a private matter of paternity could converge so dramatically? Or are we witnessing, in real time, the unpredictable consequences of human action, magnified by wealth, celebrity, and history? The tension between inevitability and contingency runs through every moment of this unfolding story. It is what makes the stakes feel both urgent and unknowable. Finally, before we move forward into the deeper chapters of this investigation, we should acknowledge the unspoken undercurrent of fear and uncertainty. For Harry, for Meghan, for Archie, and for the monarchy itself, the consequences are not merely hypothetical. Decisions made in private rooms, under whispered counsel, are reverberating in ways that are already public, yet still incompletely understood. Every statement, every revelation, every leak adds another dimension. And the closer we look, the more we realize that what seems like a scandal of inheritance is, in fact, a story about identity, legitimacy, power, and trust. And yet, even with all this context, even with all these threads laid out, we have barely scratched the surface. Because the inheritance freeze, Diana's prophecy, and the DNA revelation are just the opening moves in a game whose rules are still being written. And the question that hangs over everything, quietly, ominously, is simple yet profound. How far will this ripple go before it reaches its inevitable conclusion? The answer, as we will see, is complicated, surprising, and potentially destabilizing. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The inheritance freeze wasn't just a procedural hiccup, a mere formality mismanaged behind the gilded walls of the palace. No, it was a deliberate, precise intervention, the kind of move that carries intent, weight, and consequences that stretch far beyond bank accounts or balance sheets. And the first question that arises, almost impossible to ignore, is, who had the authority to trigger this freeze? Was it the king himself, reacting out of personal fury? Or was it someone else, operating in the shadows, maneuvering through legal channels, and quietly bending centuries-old protocol to their will? For Harry, the impact must have landed like a thunderclap, not simply because of the financial implications, though those were considerable, but because of what it represented. Imagine being in your mid-30s, having already sacrificed so much to step out of the royal mold, to chart your own path, and then discovering that what was promised, what had been assumed, what had been quietly counted on, is suddenly, almost violently, suspended. And suspended for reasons that are murky, opaque, and, perhaps, deliberately obscured. There's a psychological weight in that, a strain that isn't easily quantified, a tension between anger and disbelief, between loyalty and self-preservation. The palace, of course, moved quickly, or at least it seemed to. Behind closed doors, advisors scrambled, papers shuffled, legal frameworks dusted off and re-examined. But outwardly, there was calm. The public saw nothing. They couldn't. The process itself is intentionally designed to be invisible, and yet, beneath that calm, there was fire. In the inner sanctums, words were sharp, tones clipped, and tempers flared. Sources indicate that meetings were tense, confrontations unavoidable, and at least one individual reportedly left in near tears. One can almost imagine the corridors. The quiet shuffle of polished shoes on marble floors, voices restrained but brimming with unspoken threats and impatience. The almost imperceptible pressure that comes from knowing that the stakes have escalated beyond anything previously encountered in recent royal history. And then there is Meghan. Her role in this is the subject of endless speculation and, in some cases, outright mischaracterization. What is clear is that her involvement was not accidental. Whether by design, persuasion, or circumstance, her influence reached deeply into the processes that led to the freeze. Insiders suggest that she was not merely a participant, but a catalyst. Her conversations, her counsel, her insistence on certain positions, subtle, firm, and persuasive, helped create a situation where the freeze could happen, and arguably, where it was inevitable. But it's important to pause and ask, was she acting with malice, or with a sense of strategic necessity? That question, simple on its surface, contains layers that are difficult to unpack without stepping carefully into conjecture and personal bias. At the same time, King Charles's reported reaction must be understood in context. Publicly composed, privately furious, the duality is essential to grasp. A monarch is, after all, trained to contain, to weigh, to act with measured restraint. But the frustration in private chambers, according to multiple sources, was intense. Words were said that would never see the light of day, warnings issued, ultimatums implied. And within that fury, a sense of personal betrayal, not just by the mechanics of the inheritance or the freeze itself, but by the perception of influence, manipulation, and challenge to authority. The emotional calculus is complex. Power, protocol, and pride collided in a way that left no easy path forward. Meanwhile, the question of prophecy, Diana's prophecy, hovered like a shadow over all of it. To say that her words are haunting feels almost insufficient. They were never merely sentimental or symbolic. They carried a sharpness, a foresight that now, decades later, seems almost literal. The warning she offered about family fracture, about misunderstandings and misjudgments leading to unintended consequences, now reads like a map for what has just transpired. But that interpretation brings its own complications. Was it prediction or coincidence? Warning or psychological imprint? The ambiguity is part of what gives the story its tension. The prophecy does not resolve anything. It deepens questions and intensifies stakes. As if that weren't enough, the DNA revelation adds a layer of drama that is almost unbearable in its implications. Joe Giuliano's confirmed DNA, linked to Archie in ways previously unverified, reframes the entire narrative around succession, inheritance, and legitimacy. For Harry, the emotional impact must be profound. For the king, it introduces a new dimension of urgency and concern. And for the public, it challenges assumptions about truth, family, and perception. Every detail that emerges from the lab, every confidential report, every whispered confirmation, creates a cascade of implications that ripple outward, affecting relationships, reputations, and historical records alike. And yet, there is a deliberate tension in how these revelations are managed. The leaks, the selective disclosures, the framing, all contribute to a sense of incompleteness. The story is unfolding, but not fully. We, as observers, are given fragments, hints, shadows of reality. We know the inheritance is frozen. We know the DNA confirmation has occurred. But the full context, the private calculations, the subtleties of influence and intent remain out of reach. That distance between what is known and what is hidden is where the drama lives. It is where the suspense thrives, where curiosity persists, and where engagement is sustained. Consider for a moment the interplay of human emotion in all of this. Harry, caught between loyalty to family and the pull of independent action. Meghan, balancing ambition, protection, and strategy. King Charles, navigating fury, responsibility, and historical precedent. And the shadow of Diana, whose absence is palpable in every reaction, every decision, every whispered caution. The intersection of these human forces creates a pressure cooker, where each choice carries amplified significance, where the smallest misstep could alter the trajectory of lives, legacies, and even the monarchy itself. And then there is the media. As these events unfolded behind the palace walls, reporters, commentators, and social media voices began to interpret, analyze, and, in some cases, sensationalize what was happening. Headlines emerged, each one framing the narrative differently, each one influencing perception in subtle or overt ways. Yet despite the proliferation of information, clarity remains elusive. Conflicting accounts, anonymous sources, and strategic leaks make it difficult to discern fact from conjecture. And in this fog of narrative, the palace's ability to control the story, or at least mitigate damage, is severely tested. Yet for all the drama, one can't overlook the very human, very personal dimensions of this crisis. Harry faces not only a frozen inheritance and questions about paternity, but also the emotional weight of expectation and disappointment. Meghan navigates scrutiny, suspicion, and influence, walking a line between assertive agency and the perception of manipulation. The king, meanwhile, balances personal frustration with institutional responsibility, attempting to manage consequences that are as public as they are private. Each individual is caught in a web of circumstance and choice, none of which are simple, none of which are fully visible to the outside world. As the tension escalates, questions naturally emerge. How will this affect the line of succession, if at all? What precedents are being set within the royal family regarding inheritance, influence, and transparency? And perhaps most importantly, how will these revelations shape public perception of a monarchy already under intense scrutiny? The answers are far from straightforward. Each decision, each action, each confirmation of DNA or financial maneuver feeds into a larger, more intricate narrative that continues to evolve in real time. And still, even with all of this, the story is not yet fully told. The inheritance freeze, Diana's prophecy, the DNA confirmation, they are all pieces of a larger puzzle. Each piece adds tension, complicates relationships, and deepens the intrigue. Yet, as we delve further, the implications become even more profound. Legal ramifications may follow. Public opinion could shift. Family dynamics may be irrevocably altered. And the emotional toll on those directly involved is impossible to overstate. But here is where the story truly intensifies. Sources indicate that there are still documents, communications, and private testimonies that have yet to surface publicly. Information that could clarify motives, intentions, and consequences, yet remains intentionally shielded. The suspense is deliberate. The timing is deliberate. And for those within the palace, the weight of anticipation, what will come next, is nearly unbearable. Every move is calculated, every word measured, yet the undercurrent of tension is palpable, almost tangible. And so, as we move toward understanding the broader implications, we must ask ourselves, what does it mean when an inheritance can be frozen at a moment's notice? When a mother's decades-old warning is realized in unexpected ways? When DNA confirmation challenges everything previously assumed about parentage and legitimacy? The answers are complicated, and the consequences are profound. They ripple through personal relatio. And so, as we move toward understanding the broader implications, we must ask ourselves, what does it mean when an inheritance can be frozen at a moment's notice? When a mother's decades-old warning is realized in unexpected ways? When DNA confirmation challenges everything previously assumed about parentage and legitimacy? The answers are complicated, and the consequences are profound. They ripple through personal relationships, institutional structures, and public perception alike. Each revelation demands reflection, yet none provide closure. And as these threads continue to weave together, financial, emotional, historical, and biological, they set the stage for conflicts and consequences that will unfold in the next chapters. The story is far from over. In fact, this is only the beginning. And the next revelation, already forming in the shadows, threatens to redefine everything once again. And the next revelation, already forming in the shadows, threatens to redefine everything once again. It begins, as so many of these crises do, with a document. Not just any document. A private memorandum, handwritten notes, a memo that moved through the palace channels in near silence. Insiders say it contained language so precise, so deliberate, that the implications were immediately clear to those who read it. Harry's access to his inheritance was now contingent on conditions he could not fully control, and as he, or more likely, his advisors, began to interpret what this meant, the magnitude of the situation became unavoidable. This wasn't just a pause in finances. It was a statement, a signal, a subtle but unmistakable message about authority, loyalty, and influence. Consider what this means psychologically. For someone who has spent decades in the shadow of expectation, navigating a world where appearances matter more than substance, discovering that access to something so fundamental can be withheld at will is destabilizing. It forces a confrontation not just with external forces, the king, the advisors, the structures of the monarchy, but with internal ones as well. Confidence, pride, trust, and a sense of security are all shaken simultaneously. And for Harry, whose past is already steeped in complexity and emotional tension, this represents another rupture in an ongoing narrative of personal and familial challenge. But it isn't merely the freeze itself that has generated tension. It's the manner in which it occurred. The timing, the subtlety, the channels chosen, everything points to orchestration. Some insiders suggest that Meghan's influence cannot be overstated. Her counsel, her strategy, her ability to navigate both public and private spheres positioned her in a way that, intentionally or not, intersected perfectly with the procedural mechanisms that made the freeze possible. The question becomes, was this action the result of deliberate maneuvering or the natural consequence of a complex, high-stakes situation where multiple actors' decisions coincided? The ambiguity is part of what keeps this story so potent, so tense, so impossible to parse completely. And then there is King Charles, whose reaction has been described by sources as a mixture of disbelief and controlled fury. A monarch is accustomed to navigating crises, of course, but this is different. This is personal. It strikes at family loyalty, at the subtle balances of influence, and at a sense of historical responsibility that weighs heavily on a man who has spent his life preparing for the crown. His reported private confrontations, between himself and advisors, between himself and those closest to Harry, speak to a level of frustration that is rarely, if ever, visible to the public. In these private chambers, words were exchanged that could never be repeated, warnings were implied, and the tension was almost tangible. And yet, the public sees only composed statements, measured gestures, and the occasional neutral photograph, none of which convey the gravity or the personal stakes of what is occurring. The interplay between past prophecy and present action adds a further, almost surreal, dimension. Diana's words, once interpreted as emotional or symbolic, now appear uncannily prescient. Sources indicate that palace insiders have referenced her warnings explicitly, quietly acknowledging that her concerns about family fracture and public scrutiny are materializing in real time. The psychological weight of this realization, both for the family and for those interpreting events from the outside, is considerable. When prophecy intersects with tangible action, the effect is magnified. It creates a narrative that is at once historical, emotional, and procedural, layered in ways that are difficult to untangle but impossible to ignore. And while all of this is unfolding, there is the matter of DNA, which has introduced an entirely new axis of tension. Joe Giuliano's confirmed connection to Archie, verified through meticulous testing and secure documentation, raises questions that extend far beyond private curiosity. For Harry, it is an emotional earthquake. For King Charles, a complex strategic and familial dilemma. And for the public, a challenge to assumptions about truth, legitimacy, and the perceived order of succession. Every report, every whisper of confirmation, every fragment of evidence adds weight to the narrative, yet none of it resolves the fundamental questions. What does this mean for family bonds, for legal rights, and for public perception? The combination of these forces, frozen inheritance, historical prophecy, and confirmed DNA, creates a unique kind of pressure, one that is both procedural and profoundly personal. Each decision, each revelation, reverberates outward, affecting not only those directly involved but the structures around them, the monarchy, the advisory networks, and the mechanisms of public communication. The stakes are simultaneously intimate and institutional, emotional and systemic. And in that tension lies the gripping uncertainty that defines this story. Meanwhile, the media and the public gaze swirl around these developments, eager to interpret, speculate, and assign blame. Leaks, anonymous sources, and carefully curated disclosures feed a narrative that is at once partial and sensational, yet also rooted in reality. The public consumes fragments, pieces that are filtered through interpretation and speculation, often misunderstanding nuance, missing context, or overemphasizing surface drama. Yet even in this partial transparency, the tension escalates. Viewers are drawn in, emotionally engaged, yet never fully satisfied, compelled to follow each development with both skepticism and fascination. Harry himself, navigating this maelstrom, faces not only external pressures but internal contradictions. Loyalty versus independence, trust versus doubt, public duty versus private necessity. Each element of the inheritance freeze and DNA revelation compounds these conflicts, forcing decisions that are not merely strategic but existential. What is the weight of legacy when the structures that uphold it are suddenly unstable? How does one maintain identity when the very facts of lineage are called into question? And how does one respond when the forces of influence, manipulation, and historical precedent collide in ways that cannot be fully anticipated? At the same time, Meghan's presence in this narrative is both magnetic and polarizing. Her influence is undeniable, yet the motivations and intentions are layered, complex, and deliberately obscured. Was her counsel strategic foresight, personal ambition, or a mixture of both? And how does her agency intersect with the structural forces of monarchy and public perception? The ambiguity, while frustrating, is integral to the story. It underscores the uncertainty and elevates the stakes, reminding us that power in this context is rarely linear, rarely transparent, and rarely contained. Yet, even as these layers unfold, the story is far from complete. Legal ramifications loom on the horizon. Succession rules, inheritance laws, and public scrutiny are poised to intersect in unpredictable ways. Advisors speculate quietly about the potential fallout, about the calculations and counter-calculations that might unfold in the coming months. And all the while, the emotional currents, disappointment, anger, betrayal, anxiety, continue to flow, sometimes visible in gestures, sometimes hidden beneath composed public appearances, but always present, shaping decisions and outcomes. And in the midst of all this, one question persists, quietly, insistently. What is the ultimate objective? Are these actions, inheritance freeze, strategic maneuvering, influence over decisions, merely reactions to circumstance, or are they part of a broader design? If there is design, who is orchestrating it, and to what end? The answers are obscured by layers of secrecy, discretion, and deliberate ambiguity. And it is precisely this uncertainty that sustains the tension, that keeps each revelation from fully resolving the narrative, and that drives us forward, hungry for insight, analysis, and understanding. Finally, as the implications ripple outward, financial, emotional, historical, the story begins to coalesce into a pattern, one that is both fascinating and unsettling. Every element is connected. The frozen inheritance, the prophecy, the DNA revelation, the subtle influence, the fury of a king, the strategic calculations of those close to Harry. Each factor feeds into the others, creating a complex, multidimensional drama that defies simple interpretation. And yet, even as we observe this unfolding, there remains one final, critical question looming over all. What happens when the next layer of truth is revealed, when the next domino falls, when the private realities of the palace collide with the public perception of the monarchy? That next revelation, sources indicate, is already on the horizon, and it promises to disrupt everything once again. And that next revelation was coming faster than anyone could have anticipated. While the inheritance freeze and DNA confirmation had already sent shockwaves through the palace corridors, there was a piece of the puzzle that even the closest insiders hadn't fully anticipated: the subtle, almost invisible interplay of legal maneuvering, personal influence, and historical precedent. Sources suggest that behind closed doors, advisors were poring over decades-old documents, family trusts, and precedent cases, trying to understand how one person's action, quiet, decisive, and almost imperceptible, could halt the flow of wealth intended for a prince. And they weren't just analyzing finances, they were calculating the ripple effects, trying to anticipate reactions from Harry, Meghan, and the public alike. Every clause, every legal footnote, every line of protocol mattered. And yet, the more they analyzed, the less predictable the outcome became. For Harry, the situation had escalated from inconvenient to existential. It's one thing to experience frustration or disappointment. It's another to feel your position, your identity, and your expectations questioned all at once. This was not merely about money. It was about legitimacy, influence, and autonomy. And the added dimension of Diana's prophecy hovering over the entire scenario created a tension that was almost suffocating. Imagine, for a moment, being aware that your mother's words, spoken decades before, when you were just a child, could now be interpreted as predictive, even prophetic, and that every action you take might be framed against that backdrop. The psychological complexity is staggering, almost impossible to fully articulate. And yet, it was real, palpable, and inescapable. Meanwhile, the DNA revelation had thrown another wrench into an already precarious situation. Joe Giuliano's confirmed link to Archie was not just a minor footnote in a family narrative. It was a seismic shift, the kind of information that could upend everything assumed about inheritance, titles, and family loyalty. And the confirmation process, painstaking and meticulous, left little room for doubt. Once the results were known to the palace, advisors scrambled to understand the implications, not just for Harry and Archie, but for the monarchy as an institution. How do you reconcile centuries of lineage with a revelation that challenges perception at every level? How do you manage the tension between privacy, public scrutiny, and institutional integrity? These questions do not have simple answers, and the silence from official channels only amplified the tension. At the center of this storm was Meghan, whose role has been dissected, debated, and speculated upon endlessly. But one thing is clear: her influence has been substantial. Sources indicate that her guidance, her strategic acumen, and her understanding of both legal and media landscapes positioned her in ways that intersected with these events. Whether she intended to catalyze them or merely navigate them is difficult to determine, but the effect is undeniable. For the king, Meghan's presence is both a challenge and a complication, a factor that forces confrontation with not just policy and protocol, but with emotion, perception, and familial loyalty. King Charles's reported reactions reveal a complex emotional and strategic landscape. On one hand, there is the fury of a father, confronted with what he perceives as a challenge to authority and family stability. On the other, there is the measured caution of a monarch, aware that every decision carries historical weight, public visibility, and potential institutional consequence. Sources suggest that meetings were intense, sometimes heated, and filled with subtext. Every word, every glance, every implied threat was calculated, creating a pressure cooker atmosphere where even small mistakes could have outsized effects. And the emotional weight, anger, disappointment, worry, intersected with the procedural, creating a tension that few have ever seen outside of private palace circles. Adding to the complexity is the public perception, which, though only partially informed, exerts tremendous pressure on the family. Media reports, social media speculation, and public commentary create a feedback loop. Partial information fuels interpretation, which fuels reaction, which in turn shapes further disclosure. For Harry and Meghan, this means navigating a minefield where every statement or appearance is analyzed, often misinterpreted, and always contextualized against the broader narrative. The consequences are real, immediate, and emotionally taxing. And yet, the family must act with composure, maintaining both dignity and control while the world watches and waits for clarity that may never fully arrive. The interplay of secrecy and exposure is crucial here. Documents, private communications, and insider testimony exist, but are selectively revealed, filtered, and sometimes misinterpreted. The palace functions, in part, by controlling access and information flow, yet leaks and anonymous sources continuously challenge that control. This dynamic creates a persistent uncertainty, one that forces every actor to anticipate reactions, calculate risks, and manage both internal and external pressures simultaneously. And the tension generated by this ambiguity is palpable. It keeps the story alive, compelling, and emotionally charged. Meanwhile, Harry is grappling with profound personal contradictions. Loyalty versus independence, public duty versus private needs, trust versus doubt. Each revelation, each move, each whisper of consequence forces him to navigate complex emotional terrain. How does one maintain a sense of self when every assumed right, every expectation, is suddenly subject to question? How do you act decisively when the forces arrayed against you are both personal and institutional, known and hidden, immediate and historical? These are questions that defy easy resolution and yet demand attention, focus, and careful judgment. And Meghan's role, always a source of intrigue and debate, adds another layer of tension. Her guidance, influence, and strategic thinking have been integral, yet the public narrative often mischaracterizes her actions, reducing complex maneuvers to oversimplified motives. In reality, she operates in a space of nuance, navigating influence, perception, and opportunity. The ambiguity of her role, both real and perceived, creates tension not only within the family, but also in the public imagination. Each action, each statement, each gesture is magnified, interpreted, and often distorted, creating additional pressure on everyone involved. Legal considerations further complicate the narrative. The inheritance freeze intersects with established laws, precedents, and institutional norms, creating a labyrinth of potential outcomes. Advisors analyze historical cases, cross-reference legal texts, and evaluate potential strategies, all while managing the emotional dynamics of the family. And every step taken, every decision considered, is influenced by both legal necessity and the desire to maintain personal and institutional integrity. The complexity is immense, the stakes are high, and the consequences of error, real or perceived, are substantial. And then there is the historical dimension, the weight of Diana's words, the shadow of her warnings, and the emotional resonance of her absence. Her prophecy, once interpreted as metaphorical or emotional, now appears uncannily predictive. This creates a tension between history and present action, between private memory and public event. Each move is not only a response to current circumstances, but also a reflection on decades of familial patterns, expectations, and unresolved emotional threads. The psychological depth is immense, layering complexity over strategy, emotion, and consequence. As we begin to examine the broader implications, the story expands outward. The inheritance freeze, DNA confirmation, and prophecy confirmation intersect with questions of public perception, media framing, and institutional stability. Each revelation is not isolated. Each reverberates through the monarchy, the public imagination, and the family's internal dynamics. And yet, even with all these elements in play, the story remains unfinished. There are still secrets, still communications, still analyses that have yet to emerge, documents, testimonies, and evidence that could alter the interpretation of events dramatically. And so, as the narrative develops, one central tension becomes impossible to ignore: the collision between personal agency and institutional structure. Every actor, Harry, Meghan, Charles, advisors, is navigating a complex web of influence, obligation, and expectation. And within this web, each decision carries amplified consequences, each choice reverberates beyond the immediate context, and each revelation reshapes understanding. The result is a slow-burning drama, a layered, multidimensional narrative that combines personal emotion, historical resonance, and institutional gravity. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of all is the uncertainty about what will come next. Even with the inheritance frozen and DNA confirmed, the story is far from resolved. There are hints, sources indicate, of additional communications, strategic considerations, and emotional confrontations that have yet to surface. The next revelation, according to insiders, is poised to upend assumptions once again, introducing new questions, new tensions, and new dynamics. And as these forces converge, the palace and the public are left to wonder, what happens when the next layer of truth is finally revealed? And as the next layer began to emerge, it became clear that this story was no longer just about inheritance or DNA. It was about leverage. Sources inside the palace spoke of meetings that stretched long into the night. And then there is the media, which both amplifies and distorts. Headlines, social media speculation, and analyst commentary create a parallel narrative, one that intersects with reality but is filtered through interpretation, bias, and partial information. This amplifies pressure on all actors, as public perception influences strategy and decision-making. And in this feedback loop, tension escalates. Each leak, each report, each rumor adds weight, yet clarity remains elusive. Observers are engaged, yet the full picture remains just out of reach, heightening suspense. In this environment, the psychological and emotional stakes are enormous. Harry, Meghan, the king, all are navigating pressures that blend the personal, the institutional, and the historical. Each revelation reshapes relationships, expectations, and perception. Trust is tested, loyalties are strained, decisions are fraught. And as the narrative unfolds, the complexity only increases, suggesting that what has already occurred is merely the beginning of a sequence with far-reaching consequences. And finally, as all these elements converge, inheritance freeze, DNA confirmation, historical prophecy, strategic influence, the next stage looms. Sources indicate that additional documents, communications, and confidential observations are ready to surface. When they do, the stakes will escalate further. And the question, quiet but insistent, hangs over everything. What will happen when the next domino falls, when the next revelation emerges, and when the private truths of the palace collide with public perception once again? The answer is uncertain, but the tension is undeniable. And as the tension mounted, the next layer of the story began to take shape, one that few could have anticipated in both scope and implication. This was not simply about frozen finances or a private family disagreement. It was about control. Control over narrative, control over perception, and, most critically, control over what the world would come to know about Harry, Meghan, and Archie. Sources within the palace indicate that behind closed doors, advisors were crafting strategies not just to address the freeze, but to anticipate the fallout from DNA confirmation, to shape messaging, and to minimize the appearance of discord. All while balancing the king's fury, Harry's growing frustration, and Meghan's deliberate influence. It started with the subtle, almost invisible pressures that operate within any institution governed by centuries of tradition. Legal memos, financial directives, and confidential advisories were circulated among key players with precision, each document chosen for maximum effect and discretion. Timing was everything. Even a single signature, a carefully worded email, or a private conversation could accelerate or derail the unfolding consequences. And in this controlled chaos, the balance of power was in constant flux. Who would act next and how? That question hung in the air like an unspoken threat, and the answers were as uncertain as they were consequential. For Harry, this period must have felt like a relentless storm. Not only was access to his inheritance blocked, but each revelation seemed to compound the pressure on him, both personally and publicly. The inheritance freeze, while ostensibly a financial maneuver, carried deeper significance. It was a reflection of authority, influence, and familial tension. The symbolism alone was immense. A message, perhaps unspoken, that personal agency has limits even for a prince. And yet, he was not powerless. Every move he made, every decision to consult, challenge, or comply, had consequences. And those consequences were magnified by the shadow of public scrutiny and historical context. Meghan's role in this evolving scenario cannot be overstated. According to multiple sources, her influence was not only strategic but also deeply calculated. She understood, perhaps instinctively, how to navigate the labyrinth of royal protocol, media perception, and legal nuance. Her actions were deliberate, shaping outcomes without overt confrontation, guiding decisions, and subtly steering the conversation. And yet, her agency is also a point of tension between perception and reality, between public narrative and private strategy. Some insiders frame her as a catalyst, others as a calculated force. Regardless, her presence altered the trajectory of events, creating dynamics that were both complex and compelling. King Charles, meanwhile, was operating in a delicate balance between personal emotion and institutional responsibility. His reported fury, while restrained publicly, was palpable in private discussions. Advisors describe a series of intense meetings, each loaded with both historical weight and immediate consequence. The king had to consider legacy, public perception, and the delicate equilibrium of family dynamics, all while responding to actions that challenged authority and protocol. The psychological tension, both for him and for the advisors navigating his expectations, was extraordinary. Every word mattered, every tone was scrutinized, and every decision carried the potential to ripple outward in unforeseen ways. And then there was the element of prophecy, the enduring shadow of Diana's warnings. Once perceived as sentimental or abstract, her words now carry the weight of seeming prediction. Sources suggest that references to her warnings appeared repeatedly in private communications, quietly framing discussions and influencing perspectives. Her concerns about family fracture, public scrutiny, and the consequences of unchecked action were cited in ways that underscored their enduring relevance. The prophecy, once distant, now seemed immediate. A lens through which all current events were interpreted, adding a psychological and emotional layer that compounded the practical realities of inheritance and DNA confirmation. The DNA revelation itself created an entirely new axis of tension. Joe Giuliano's confirmed connection to Archie was not merely a matter of curiosity. It was a disruptor, a variable that altered assumptions about legitimacy, succession, and personal identity. For Harry, the emotional impact was profound. For the king, the revelation demanded strategic consideration, weighing family stability against public perception. And for the public, the confirmation challenged entrenched notions of narrative, legacy, and expectation. Each confirmation, each whispered detail, and each carefully managed disclosure added weight to the unfolding drama, layering complexity over consequence. The interaction of these forces, inheritance freeze, historical prophecy, DNA confirmation, produced a pressure that extended far beyond the individuals involved. Advisors worked in what some describe as an atmosphere of intense calculation, balancing legal precedent, strategic counsel, and emotional response. Every move was evaluated not only for immediate effect, but for long-term consequence. And the psychological toll on those navigating this landscape, Harry, Meghan, and the king, was immense. Decisions had to account for legacy, public perception, familial relationships, and institutional precedent, all simultaneously. The complexity of such decision-making is difficult to overstate. Meanwhile, the public narrative began to form, filtered through media coverage, leaks, and social speculation. The story, already laden with complexity, became more challenging to interpret as fragments of truth, conjecture, and selective disclosure combined. Headlines emerged that suggested scandal, strategy, or manipulation. Social media commentary ranged from outrage to fascination. This environment created a feedback loop in which perception influenced action and action influenced perception. For the family, managing both the internal realities and the external narratives required constant vigilance, strategic communication, and nuanced understanding of timing and influence. Harry's emotional landscape during this period was particularly fraught. Loyalty to family, the desire to protect Archie, the instinct to assert autonomy, and the need to maintain public composure all converged in ways that were psychologically complex and deeply taxing. Each action or inaction was laden with potential consequence. Trust was tested at multiple levels, between siblings, between advisors, and within the marital partnership itself. And the public, largely unaware of the full context, interpreted partial information, adding external pressure to an already volatile situation. Meghan's influence, while strategic, was not without controversy or scrutiny. Her presence in private discussions, her guidance in navigating both procedural and public spheres, and her capacity to anticipate the cascading effects of each development made her a critical figure. Yet her role also generated tension and speculation, both within and outside the palace. The ambiguity of her intentions, whether tactical, protective, or opportunistic, added a further layer of intrigue, complicating both internal decision-making and external perception. Legal considerations compounded the tension. The inheritance freeze intersected with established rules, historical precedent, and the potential for legal challenge. Advisors analyzed not only the immediate implications, but also potential ripple effects for succession, trust management, and public interpretation. Each option, each potential move, was evaluated for risk and consequence. And in parallel, the confirmed DNA connection introduced variables that could alter legal, personal, and institutional assumptions in ways that remain difficult to predict. The convergence of these forces, personal, institutional, historical, and legal, created an environment in which every move carried heightened significance. Communication, both formal and informal, became a critical tool, as did perception management. Advisors worked to anticipate not only the immediate consequences, but also the cascading effects, carefully balancing transparency, discretion, and influence. The stakes were simultaneously emotional, procedural, and symbolic, creating a narrative tension that was almost impossible to escape. And as all of these elements continued to interact, one overarching question emerged. What comes next? The inheritance freeze, DNA confirmation, and historical prophecy have set the stage for further developments that are already hinted at in private discussions and confidential communications. The next revelation, sources suggest, could shift the landscape once again, introducing new tensions, unexpected alliances, and consequences that may reverberate for years to come. And as the palace prepared for the next wave of consequences, one fact became unavoidable. The story was no longer just about family dynamics. It was about power. The inheritance freeze had set the tone, creating a precedent that no member of the family could ignore. Sources indicate that advisors were poring over legal documents, trust agreements, and internal memoranda, trying to anticipate the fallout of each potential move. Every clause, every carefully worded sentence, every procedural nuance became a weapon or a shield, depending on how it was wielded. And for Harry, each revelation compounded the pressure. It wasn't just financial, it was existential. The emotional dimension of the situation cannot be overstated. Imagine having your expectations of legacy and entitlement suddenly suspended, and not by circumstance, but by the deliberate orchestration of powers beyond your immediate control. That is what Harry faced. And in parallel, there was the constant presence of Meghan, whose influence is described by insiders as both strategic and subtly persuasive. Some view her as a catalyst, others as a facilitator, but there's no disputing that her actions shaped the trajectory of events. Her presence is calculated, deliberate, and, for those inside the palace, impossible to ignore. King Charles, meanwhile, was navigating a labyrinth of emotion and responsibility. His reported private conversations reveal a mixture of fury, strategic concern, and paternal anxiety. One source described the atmosphere as tense but precise, like a room full of actors waiting for the right cue. Every word was weighed against decades of protocol and expectation. Every gesture carried meaning. And yet, even in moments of controlled composure, the undercurrent of frustration was palpable. The king understood that decisions made now would reverberate for years, shaping both familial relationships and institutional precedent. The DNA revelation added a dimension of complexity that was almost unprecedented. Joe Giuliano's confirmed connection to Archie didn't merely challenge assumptions, it threatened to upend them entirely. For Harry, the psychological implications were profound. Questions of identity, legitimacy, and parental responsibility collided in ways that left no room for easy resolution. For the king, the revelation required a careful recalibration of both strategy and public narrative. And for the broader public, this confirmation challenged long-held perceptions, demanding reassessment and, in many cases, disbelief. Public perception itself became a variable that could not be ignored. Media coverage, social commentary, and speculative reporting created a feedback loop that influenced both the family's strategy and public interpretation. Leaks, intentional or otherwise, amplified the tension. Headlines framed narratives, often oversimplifying or distorting nuance. Social media exploded with commentary, assumptions, and speculation, creating pressure on all parties to manage both perception and reality. The resulting uncertainty only heightened the stakes, making each decision more consequential, each reaction more scrutinized. Harry's internal struggle intensified under this pressure. Loyalty to family, duty to Archie, personal autonomy, and public image collided in ways that demanded constant navigation. Each action or inaction carried risk, potentially altering relationships, institutional stability, and public perception. Trust was tested at every level. Between siblings, between advisors, between the marital partnership itself. And yet, even as uncertainty loomed, the next step had to be considered carefully, weighing immediate emotional reactions against long-term consequences. Meghan's role remained both central and ambiguous. Her guidance, counsel, and strategic insight were critical, yet open to interpretation. To some, she was the architect of these developments. To others, a participant navigating circumstances beyond her control. The ambiguity itself became part of the story, creating tension that extended beyond private interactions into the public narrative. Her presence influenced strategy, perception, and emotional dynamics, ensuring that each move carried additional weight. The interplay of law and legacy compounded the complexity. Advisors meticulously reviewed precedents, succession rules, and trust agreements, analyzing potential consequences for inheritance, titles, and public perception. The inheritance freeze intersected with historical norms and legal frameworks, creating a scenario where each action, whether approval, challenge, or compliance, could trigger ripple effects throughout the monarchy. Simultaneously, DNA confirmation introduced variables that were difficult to anticipate, making each decision more consequential than any prior assumption could predict. And as these forces converged, one overriding tension persisted: the collision of personal agency with institutional structure. Every participant, Harry, Meghan, Charles, advisors, navigated a delicate web of influence, expectation, and precedent. Each decision, each reaction, each communication carried amplified consequences. The stakes were simultaneously emotional, legal, procedural, and symbolic, creating a dynamic that was complex, layered, and highly charged. Meanwhile, the historical shadow of Diana loomed over every interaction. Her words, once abstract and interpreted emotionally, now seemed predictive, as though she had seen the tensions, conflicts, and fractures that were emerging decades later. References to her prophecy surfaced repeatedly in private discussions, influencing strategy, shaping perspective, and framing the psychological context for those involved. The weight of her legacy, combined with the immediacy of unfolding events, created an almost unbearable pressure on all actors. As the palace continued to navigate these developments, one fact became increasingly clear: more revelations were imminent. Confidential communications, undisclosed documents, and private observations hinted at further layers of complexity yet to emerge. Each revelation promised to alter assumptions, create new tensions, and reshape relationships in ways that would extend beyond immediate consequences. And for Harry, Meghan, and Charles, the anticipation of what was coming created its own kind of pressure, a psychological and strategic tension that could not be ignored. The interplay between public perception, legal strategy, and personal agency created a scenario in which clarity was elusive. Each move was scrutinized, each action measured, and each outcome uncertain. Advisors, aware of the stakes, worked tirelessly to anticipate reactions, mitigate risks, and navigate the complex emotional and institutional landscape. And yet, despite all preparation, unpredictability remained. Every new detail, every leak, every insight introduced a new variable, keeping tension high and certainty low. And finally, as all these elements coalesced, one overarching question remained unresolved: what happens when the next revelation emerges? The inheritance freeze, DNA confirmation, and prophecy confirmation had set the stage, but insiders indicate that additional disclosures were already forming: communications, observations, and actions that could once again shift power, influence, and perception. The anticipation of what was coming added an additional layer of suspense, as everyone involved, from the highest-ranking advisors to the most personally affected family members, awaited the next domino to fall. The stage was set. The players were in motion, and the next revelation, already whispered about in confidential channels, threatened to redefine the story entirely, reshaping relationships, legacy, and public perception in ways that no one could yet fully anticipate. And the palace braced itself for what came next, though no one outside its walls could fully grasp the magnitude. Sources indicate that the upcoming revelation was not minor: a subtle leak, a private conversation, or a confidential memo. But something far more consequential. It was the kind of disclosure that could alter calculations, upset carefully maintained balances, and force decisions that would reverberate for months, perhaps years. Every actor in this drama, Harry, Meghan, Charles, and the advisors, was acutely aware that a new set of facts was approaching, one that might undo prior assumptions and challenge every decision made so far. The inheritance freeze had already changed the dynamics dramatically. Harry, for one, could no longer operate under the assumption that his path forward was predictable or secure. Every plan, every negotiation, every trust in established procedures had been disrupted, and the psychological toll of that disruption cannot be overstated. Imagine years of expectation, layered with personal and familial history, suddenly suspended. It forces confrontation not only with external forces, but with internal ones. Self-doubt, frustration, and the haunting awareness that nothing is guaranteed. And in the midst of that uncertainty, he had to make choices. choices that could define not only his own future, but that of his son, his marriage.